A very good afternoon to everyone. Professor Darrell, Mann, Chief Executive Officer, Systematic Innovation Limited, colleagues from the CSIR, and friends who have joined us at the program today. Warm greetings to you all. It gives me great pleasure to have you all on this very special day where we are celebrating the Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav, which is focused on intellectual property rights. So today we are celebrating one of the programs under the Rashtriya Bauddhik Sampada Mahotsav. I thank the organizers, the Department of Scientific and Industrial Research and the DPIIT, and our partners, NRDC, Intellectual Property Office of India, PPVFRA, for this wonderful cooperation. As you all know, intellectual property rights have been and will remain an important subject matter as we progress more faster, more rapidly in this era of high global competitiveness. Luckily for the CSIR, thanks to the efforts of Dr. Mashelkar and all the other DGs, we've been quite cognizant of this very important aspect. And we today bring you a very special talk on Bulletproof IP through TRIZ by Professor Mann. TRIZ, or the theory of inventive problem solving, owes its origins to a Russian patent reviewer, General Karl Schuler, at the Russian Naval Patent Office in 1946. The patent reviewer examined about 2 lakh patents to work on the hypothesis that there is a definitive pattern in the way innovations take place in technical systems. He looked for patterns and principles that relate to patenting technical solutions and focused at systematic identification of unresolved contradictions and arriving firstly at generic and then specific solutions. TRIZ today, with adaptations, is a proven tool across various and diverse subject domains. We are very fortunate to have with us Professor Darrell, Mann, who has worked extensively on this topic and has developed several adaptations to this original framework. Professor Darrell, Mann, who is here with us today, thanks so much, Darrell, is the Chief Executive Officer of Systematic Innovation Limited from the UK. For the first 15 years of his career, Darrell held a number of positions at the Rolls-Royce and was responsible for the conception, design, and validation of a range of new military aerospace products. Over the course of the last 25 years, Darrell has helped deliver over $6 billion in new product-derived value to clients in every industry and across 50 countries, including serving as a spark behind a dozen successful spin-out companies. Darrell is the author of over 1,000 innovation-related papers, articles, and innovation-related textbooks. And he has helped generate over 1,000 patents and worked with clients to design around or bulletproof over 5,000 more. It gives me great pleasure, Darrell, to have you here with us and welcome you and all the participants to the program. I'm as excited as any of my other colleagues who has joined us here on this platform to listen to you about TRIZ and how we could adopt this in the CSIR and in any of our works. Once again, thank you so much. The platform is all yours, Darrell.
Super. Well, thank you so much for the invitation. It's been a real honor to be invited. So let me put some slides up on the screen and let's get started. Yes, I'll say I feel really privileged to have the possibility of speaking to you. So thank you very much also, Vishwajani, for the introduction. And yeah, I often feel like the luckiest person on the planet. These are some of the companies that we get to work with over the years. And I spent quite a lot of time in India. And in fact, since the pandemic, I was in Mumbai and Pune earlier this month for the first time since 2019. So it's I really missed the country. I put this slide up really just to say that I think there's 2 things important about this topic of IP and the application of TRIZ to the story. I think the first is that I think many organizations, I think all of the companies on this slide here and the government agencies as well, are finding innovation difficult. And I think the main reason for that is that the better companies are at operational excellence, the more challenging they're going to find the innovation story, because the skills to be operational excellent and the skills to be innovative and to be able to create new solutions are completely different to one another. My organisation is a tiny one. We're 40 people full time. So I sometimes have to pinch myself contemplating that these organisations come and work with us. I think the main reason for that is one of the things that TRIZ tells us, and all the research that Genry Kalcher and his team did in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and now our team has been doing since the late 1990s, is someone somewhere solved your problem. And I'm conscious when I'm talking to an audience of people who are scientists and pioneers, it's a difficult thing to comprehend. And I think it's the same actually also for all these organizations here, because everybody, I think, believes that they're world class. So how can it possibly be that somebody has already been doing some hard work and has solved my problem for me? The simple answer to that question is that there's somebody that's been working on a problem like yours is not in your industry, is not in your domain. If they were, you'd know about them these days. I think it's very easy to access what people are doing in and around the domain of specialism that we've got. So what TRIZ is giving these organizations, you can see on the screen here, is a bridge to somebody in another industry that's had a version of the problem that you're facing. And very often the best way to go and find that person in the other industry is think of somebody with a more extreme version of your problem. And as we go through this presentation, I'll give you one or two examples of what that means in practice, and how TRIZ allows us to systematically jump to other domains and see what's happening there and bring back some solution clues back to our own scientific challenges. So I'll begin also with a question, which I'll come back to at the end of the presentation. Some of you, I'm sure, will be familiar with this solution from Carbon Robotics, which has made quite an impact, I would say, on the world of agriculture, and certainly in terms of the potential. So here's a laser weeding machine, and two technologies primarily involved in it. First, as you can see with those flashes of light there, is using laser to kill weeds in a field. And the second one is the AI, which enables the laser device to recognize what's a weed and what isn't a weed. So the question I want to plant in your mind is three. You can see at the bottom of this slide here. So when could we have predicted this technology? When could we have patented it? And when could we have produced it and made it into a commercial solution? So I'm conscious that the CSR, then we're primarily looking at TRLs 1 through to 6, and then we're going to hand over to somebody else. So it's that when could we have produced it? It's kind of when do we get to that TRL 6 level? So I'll come back to those things towards the end, and hopefully between now and when we get the answer to these questions, we'll get a better idea of how TRIZ can help us to predict and patent, and also do some of the work for getting through the TRL journey. So let's set the context a little bit. This is data which is a little bit out of date. I think increasingly there's a reluctance to publish this kind of data because the story seems to get worse and worse. But what the divergence on this graph is showing is that companies, government institutions are spending more on R&D. I think there's a growing awareness that we all need to be doing that. The world's got some big problems that need to be solved. But then the divergence says, okay, well, if we look at what's coming out of the pipeline in terms of value generating solutions, then that's very definitely on a downward trajectory. So we're spending more to get less. And I think it's what it's causing us to realize, and my research team, we've been in place since 1999, and we've now looked at 11.5 million case studies where people have tried to innovate, and the overall total right now has remained fairly constant actually, but is at 98%. So in other words, 98% of attempts to innovate. So if you go right back to the TRL 1 stage, how many of those ideas and concepts are going to make it all the way through to value, where we've identified a customer and we're serving that customer in the way that they would like us, and we're able to generate a positive return on investment. So the headline number is 98% of things are not going to make it all the way through to that journey. Now, I'm conscious that not everybody defines innovation in the same way, but I think we've been very fortunate over the years in including success as part of the definition. So one of the first questions we'll ask when we're working with a client is, okay, well, so what does success look like for you? If it's a private company, then the measure is very likely to be in monetary terms. If we're working with the healthcare sector, for example, then very often it's going to be in terms of quality of life, life expectancy, recovery rates of patients. So define what success looks like, and then we use that as a criterion to help us to understand whether we've been successful with our innovation attempt. We know, I think, how things fail. I'm not going to go to that pie chart in any great detail. We can come back to it if anybody's interested. But I think one of the challenges we can see there, so I've got 5 different segments. The one I'm going to focus on is we failed because the yellow segment says we didn't produce the right product or service yet, so the technology was not the right solution. But I think the things to sit in the background as I'm talking is the biggest segment is the green one there, which says we had a great idea and we were able to produce the idea, but we didn't have a satisfactory route to market. And that, I think, is particularly relevant to spin out companies from universities that we work with a lot, for any kind of startup organization. When you're a small entity, then if you're entering a market that's already got some big players in it, those big players have got every incentive to not allow you to be successful. In fact, one of the best opportunities is to get them to buy you. And that's still not a guarantee that your technology is going to hit the market, because very often we've seen the big companies will buy the technology deliberately to keep it off the market. But as I say, I'm going to focus on the yellow stuff, because I think that's where TRIZ has its most traditional role and gets right to the heart of the IP story. So here's the carbon robotics patent application. Interestingly, it's not been granted yet, and I'm not sure it will be actually. There's on the left-hand side of this slide, you can see that the patent application they wrote, the first 64 claims have already been rejected by the examiner. So we're up to claim 65 now, which is already a sign that this is not a particularly strong or strongly written piece of intellectual property. One of the questions that we've been asked an awful lot over the years by usually the patent lawyers working within large organizations is how good is the patent? And one of the things that TRIZ enables us to do is to build tools that enable us to measure quality of patent. The one that we use is one that we developed over the years. We call it Apollo Sigma inside the organization. What it does, you can see on that matrix on the right-hand side of this slide, we've got 2 dimensions. So one is how much is the patent worth right now. Now, rather than put a dollar value on it, we've called it an index. I'll explain why that is a little bit later if we get a chance. And then the TRIZ dimension is the y-axis on this plot, which says we can also predict how much this patent is going to be worth in the future. And what that future value is really all about is how well did the inventor anticipate the fundamental direction of every technology in every market, and how well did they understand the step changes that are going to take place during that journey. So I think one of the things that is quite paradoxical about the overall TRIZ story is it says, all the research we've done says the future is very predictable in certain dimensions. Now, I'm conscious whenever I use those words that I'm saying things which are very counterintuitive to people. let me clarify a little bit. There's various parts to the future prediction story. The first part, the part which I propose, and I'm going to try hopefully demonstrate to you, is very predictable indeed, is where will things evolve in the future? The part of the story then that's very difficult to predict is timing. So knowing when something will be able to be accepted by the market, whether the technology will be ready, whether we can scale things up. The timing question is much, much more difficult. But the reason for wanting to understand quality of patents is companies like Samsung in particular, where Samsung is an organization we've worked with for over 20 years now. And last year, for the first time, they were the world #1 patenter up until 2022. I think for the last 25 years, it's always been IBM. Now it's Samsung. And what TRIZ has done for them is set up an intellectual property generation machine, because they've got a map of the future. And what they've said is that if I know where things are going to evolve in the future, I can patent those solutions. And if I do that, then the whole timing question becomes far less important, because the patent is going to buy me 20 years of margin to understand and test whether and when the market is going to be ready for these solutions. So when we analyze lots of patents using the Apollo Sigma tool, that yellow dot there on this slide here suggests that the carbon robotics patent, even if it does get granted, is not a particularly strong one. So it's in the bottom left-hand quadrant. Here's more typical sets of results. So I've not been brave enough to put the CSIR patents into the engine. Yeah, it takes a little bit of time to run because it's doing some fairly sophisticated calculation. So it's actually reading the patent text. So these are ones we've done fairly recently for clients. So on the left-hand side, there's Procter & Gamble. And then closest, I think, to CSIR, that's ITRI in Taiwan. And they produce a lot of intellectual property on behalf of the Taiwanese government for Taiwanese industry. The high quality patents, as per the convention of these 2x2 matrices, is we want to be in the top right hand quadrant, the stars quadrant, which means that I've got a patent which is worth money today, but it's also future proof. It would be very difficult to design around. It's anticipated the TRIZ trends really well. And I'm not sure if you can see the number up in the top right hand corner of the ITRI data, but the stars, there's less than 1%. So we create an awful lot of IP, but a very small percentage of it is going to be in that top right hand quadrant. And a lot of the work we're doing with clients when it comes to generating IP is how do we get ourselves creating IP which is in that quadrant. One of the ideas of the tool, in fact, is before you file the patent, before you've sent it off to the examiner in the patent office, you can run it through the software, and it can give you a pretty good indication of where it's going to end up in terms of that 2x2 matrix there. I know we do it ourselves. It can, I'm speaking as an inventor, I know it can feel a little bit depressing sometimes to put your beautiful new patent application into the software to be told that it's not as good as you thought it was. What the software will also do is give you some advice, however, on you forgot about this, you need to think about this. So let's think about where that patent software, how do I establish the quality of a patent has come from. So let's get into the TRIZ story. First thing I think to talk about with TRIZ is this idea of an overall direction. And I think one of the very early findings from Genrik Altschuler and his team, so back in 1946, 1947, they'd been asked the question, what is it that signifies a good patent? And the only thing they could do at the time was to look at products, technologies that had been commercially successful, and then come back to the patents from which they originated and see, okay, what is it about those patents that distinguishes them from all the ones that did not generate that commercial success. And the very clear message, first of all, that comes out of that analysis is there is this overall direction towards what they called increasing ideality. So that equation on the third bullet point halfway down the slide, I think as far as today's concerned, we can say that ideality is equivalent to value. I think value is a term that we use much more readily. Value is the benefits that we give to a customer divided by all the things that the customer does not want. So the customer does not want cost. The customer does not want anything which is harmful. So if there is an environmental impact, for example, that's negative, we don't want that. If we have to wait for something, we don't want that. And I think the blinding flash of the obvious from the research that Altshuler and team were doing was that if you want to be successful, you give the customer more value. So in other words, benefits goes up, costs come down, and harm comes down. So over time, one of my ongoing arguments with the sustainability community is that the nature of scientific work, of engineering work, means that harm will come down. I think the challenge that the world has got right now is it's not coming down fast enough, because customers tend to focus on the benefits first and the cost second. And if it's a difficult economy, then cost first and then benefits second, but harm reduction always comes third. That aside, this overall direction says more benefits, less negative things. The Soviet team then said, okay, well, if there's a direction, what's the end point? And that's where we get the concept of ideal final result. And literally, that's the point where you extrapolate to the end of that equation effectively and say, okay, it's the point where the customer gets all the benefits, none of the cost, and none of the harm. In other words, everything evolves towards free, perfect, and now. And anybody working in the digital world, I think, recognizes how quickly that evolution process takes place. It's much easier to innovate electrons and bits and bytes than it is physical entities where you're manipulating atoms and molecules, etc. Some of the most profitable companies on the planet right now, by the way, free, perfect, and now is their effectively their mission statement. We just got to look at Google to look at an example of that. But I know that I'm always very wary when I'm talking to particularly companies and leadership teams in companies about free, perfect, and now, because the whole idea of free is very counterintuitive for a lot of those leaders. Nevertheless, it's only a matter of time before things will head towards the end point. So an exercise that I do very frequently with groups, usually marketers, actually, because an awful lot of marketing money gets wasted because we go and ask the wrong questions. If you understand TRIZ, then you'll ask far better questions when you go and talk to customers. But this exercise says, okay, let's think about the perfect shirt. And normally within 1 or 2 minutes, we've done all the market research that would ever be useful in the textile industry. And what you find when you absorb the answers is that there are 2 ways to innovate. Okay, now, bear in mind, my definition of innovation is successful. These 2 ways effectively say opportunity 1 is you add some kind of a new function. Okay, and that means really one of 2 things. You look at existing functions and you do them better. So the perfect shirt will be self-ironing, self-cleaning, self-repairing, and so on. And then we can start adding some literally new functions. So it should be bulletproof. For example, it should measure my biometric information. The sky's the limit, I think, in terms of what new functions might we add to a shirt. I know when we did a project with Samsung, they were looking at smartphones which could be embedded in textile fabrics, which could be a cap, which could be clothing. On the right hand side then is the second way to innovate, and by far and away it's the dominant way of doing things, if only because if you add a new function, it's quite easy from an IP perspective for somebody else to also do the same thing, because part of the novelty requirements for a patent, a known combination of new things is not patentable, strictly speaking. But if we can solve a contradiction, then almost by definition, we're going to get a patentable solution. So contradiction and we use the word paradox, conundrum, trade-off. Lots of words that in TRIZ mean the same basic thing. I think we're all conditioned in life to make trade-offs. So shirts are either one color or they're another color. They're thick or they're thin. They've got a collar or they've got no collar. In TRIZ world, the world of let's run towards the contradictions because someone somewhere solved them, then it's perfectly possible to have a shirt which is red and blue. In other words, the shirt is going to change color. The shirt is going to change size. It's going to change shape, etc. And for the most part, the textile industry doesn't ask these questions because there's a perception that none of these things have been done. And they're impossible. But what I said earlier about someone somewhere solve your problem, from a TRIZ perspective, somebody somewhere has solved all of those problems. And the only thing that hasn't happened so far is nobody in the textile industry has gone to interrogate patent database and said, okay, well, is there somebody out there, most likely in a different domain, that's been thinking about color change, for example, or size change, or shape change. And as soon as you open yourself up to making those kind of leaps, then almost invariably we're going to find that somebody's done some hard work for us. Maybe not all the way to the solution, but as you can probably imagine, a lot of military innovators have been thinking about active camouflage, for example, where color change is really, really important. Some of those solutions are a little bit expensive for the retail market, but that's merely from a TRIZ perspective, the next contradiction that needs to be solved. So I think what TRIZ tries to give us is this overall direction. This picture on the left-hand side, you may have seen that a version of that image before. Inside Samsung, they've used it for a while now as a way of communicating to their engineers and their scientists what the innovator's job is all about. So number one, the cheese that the mouse is running towards, there's the perfect solution. So make sure you understand where perfect is. And then the second important part of this metaphor is the walls in the maze that the mouse has one after the other knocked those down. Those walls represent the contradictions. So what they've taught 35,000 people inside Samsung to do is, number one, go and look for contradictions. Every contradiction you can find is a great innovation opportunity. And then one after the other, we're going to knock those things down, tapping into the TRIZ databases that are going to show us how other people have successfully done that prior to us. So here's my version of that picture. It's not nearly as pretty or as metaphorical as their one is, but I think it does say something which is important, which the mouse picture doesn't give us. And this is the idea that as things evolve towards the ideal final result on the right-hand side of this slide, so we could say, if my textiles clean themselves, that's some kind of an ideal solution. Very few customers, I don't think, would enjoy spending time cleaning stuff. Then by the time that's the ideal solution, that is a point. So this whole evolution process, according to this picture, is a convergent thing. The closer I get to the ideal, the less and less possible solutions there are. And again, I think that's quite counterintuitive for a lot of people. So on the left-hand side, which is, we can say represents today, we've got a detergent manufacturer, we've got a washing machine manufacturer, we've got textile manufacturers, and they're all heading towards that end point because that's the direction of more value. The detergents that we design have to be more beneficial, deliver more benefits to the customer. In other words, less cost, less harm to the environment. Every detergent manufacturer has to move in that direction. Likewise, the washing machine manufacturer, they've got to make a better and better washing machine. But the fact that the whole story is convergent means that not all of those three players are going to make it all the way to the end. And I don't think it takes long to work out that the inevitable winner in the long term is the textile manufacturer, because they're the only ones that can control the properties of the textiles that they're producing. Now, when I was showing this picture to Procter & Gamble for the first time, as you can probably imagine, they were quite unhappy with me because they make an awful lot of money selling detergent. And it took them probably about 6 months, I would say, to realize that this threat to their business is actually the potential opportunity for the business, because the chemistry required to engineer that self-cleaning textile is the sort of knowledge that they have inside their company. And so one of the realizations for them is, okay, well, we should be developing this technology so that we can patent it. If we patent it, at the very least, that gives us an insurance policy, but it also gives us a tool to potentially license to the textile manufacturers, and it becomes a revenue stream for us without us actually having to do any hard work at all. So I think once we've got on board with this idea of convergent evolution and heading towards the ideal, it may look threatening, but within there, the evidence suggests to us that there's an opportunity. And I certainly know, all the work we do with universities and R&D labs and spin-outs, it's a really useful picture to draw for whatever domain you're working in, just to convince yourself that the passion I've got for this subject is something that's going to have a long-term future, and maybe not directly, but through some kind of other body by the time I get to the TRL 4, 5, 6, etc. All right, I thought I'd dig in a little bit deeper and look at some of the more specific route maps, I've called them here. So here's a part of TRIZ, which I think is a little bit counterintuitive, in that I think the way that we normally work, whether you're a scientist, researcher, engineer, we start with a problem. We try and understand what a customer need is. We define the problem. We generate some ideas, and hopefully then solve the problem. This part of TRIZ kind of turns that whole story around the other way and says, I'm going to tell you what the solutions are. This route map will, for either the technology word, whether it's chemistry, IT, whatever, will give us a number of very clear route maps, I propose, to show us the direction of success in a far more granular fashion. But again, I don't think we expect that to be possible. So let me just show you one of the first trend patterns that Genrik Altschuler and his team uncovered during their journey. So what they were doing was looking at particular industries and looking for step changes in those industries. So I think we can periodically see the continual improvement of things, but then occasionally you'll see someone makes a big jump. And this picture here looks at step changes in data storage, for example, where if you're as old as me, then you used to remember 8-inch floppy disks. These days we've much more virtual solutions, cloud, etc. They looked for those jumps and then they reverse engineered. Okay, what happened in those jumps? When going from a floppy disk to a USB, for example. What's the technology change? And then they looked across all the other industries and said, okay, well, can we see the same pattern in those industries? So what they were essentially looking for was this idea of discontinuous jump. So lots of incremental improvements and then occasionally a big jump. If you're familiar with S-curves, then effectively what they were looking for were those jumps from one S-curve to another S-curve. So going from landline telephone to mobile phone, for example. And let me just quickly show you how they did that with a typical example. So first thing you need to do is to identify solutions that all deliver the same function. So on the left-hand side of this slide here, we've got solutions which are all about protection. You then put them in chronological order. You're deliberately looking for the discontinuous jumps. So as you can probably imagine, looking at the left-hand side, we can optimize and optimize and optimize the design of a shield, but it's ultimately got some fundamental problems which we need a different solution completely if we're going to solve those problems. So step 3 is to work out, okay, what were those problems? So for the shield, for example, first of all, the person using it needs to hold it, and that means that their attacking capability is reduced considerably. And we also want to protect a large part of our body, but the bigger the shield is, the heavier it's going to be. So we've got an area versus weight contradiction. And when the first suit of armor comes along, then at the very least we solve the two arms problem. We give the warrior two arms again. The area versus weight problem, we've kind of made a jump there too. We've distributed the weight. Okay? But I think very importantly with these S curves is when we first make the jump, as you can probably imagine, that suit of armor there is much more expensive to manufacture than the shield was. And so for a lot of customers, then the new solution is worse because we're at the beginning of the new S curve. But as we get higher and higher up the TRL level, particularly 6, 7, 8, 9, then the manufacturing cost is going to come down and we'll climb the S curve, and eventually the top of the new S curve will be higher than we were on the previous one. And yet again, we're always going to hit the top of the S curve, and the reason the curve gets flat on the top is all those things we're trying to improve. Eventually something's going to come along and prevent us from making the improvement. And that's the contradiction part of TRIZ, which I'll come back to shortly. The suit of armor, I don't know if anybody's ever had a chance to wear a suit of armor, but you're very immobile, and if it's a warm day, then it's literally like being inside an oven. So necessity is the mother of invention. Because there are problems, inventors of the world will eventually find solutions to those problems, and we get chainmail. And then somebody else creates a new problem by inventing bullets, and therefore the protection people have to also make a jump and create the bulletproof vest. So you recognize if things get worse before they get better. It's almost inevitable. And then you just keep repeating that. So literally thousands and thousands of times. I could show you, literally thousands of examples of this trend pattern here. So let's just look at one or two. On the top of the slide, in the manufacturing sector, I want to cut things. I can use a saw. I can use a chainsaw, which adds power and adds more tools. I want to cut more accurately, so I go to a band saw, so the tool is flexible, and I put the flexible tool inside a stiff frame. Then I jump to a fluidic cutting method. So if I pressurize the fluid intelligently, I can cut through most things, but I'm going to create mess. And if it's a sterile environment, if I'm cutting food, for example, then I can avoid that problem if I jump to a laser on the right-hand side. Bottom, music. When I started buying music, it was solid lumps of plastic, and then flexible tape, and then digital on CDs, and these days MP3. Nice simple one, measuring things. I want to measure bigger and bigger distances with a smaller and smaller thing, more and more accurately. Keyboard for my computer. I don't actually want the keyboard. I want to communicate with the CPU, so I can make the keyboard first of all smaller by making it fold, and then a piece of material that's going to roll up, and then eventually a light I can project onto a surface. Don't know if anybody still uses an SLR camera, but I think we've all kind of made the digital jump these days. But where did that digital camera come from? Answer: 35mm roll of film. And then if you go right back to the beginning of photography, then it was a solid plate on the back of a camera. So I could show you thousands of these things, but if I ask you for, okay, well, can you see an overall pattern here? Then if I give you a few minutes, I'm sure we'll all come up with something like this answer here, which is literally the first trend pattern that Altshuler and his team identified. So this pattern is typically called dynamization. It basically says things tend to start off as immobile lumps, and then for various reasons, we're going to add joints to them, and then we're going to make it flexible, and then we might jump to a fluidic solution, and then we're going to end up with some kind of a field. Now, field is one of those generic TRIZ words that says, I can't tell you specifically what kind of field it's going to be. It could be a magnetic field. It could be somewhere on the electromagnetic spectrum. It's a magnetic, electrical, digital. I can't tell you which one specifically, but that's the direction you should be going to look in. So this is how companies like Samsung use this trend. So when they look at Nokia back at the beginning of the century and look at the evolution of Nokia phones, then they immediately say, okay, well, I can see that they're also following this TRIZ pattern. So they haven't gone to flexible yet. So I need to start patenting flexible things, because that's inevitably going to happen in the future. But then they got caught short a little bit, because along comes iPhone in 2007, which kind of goes backwards. Apparently goes backwards. The handset has now become a solid lump again. But the reason for that is these patterns apply not just on the macro level to the overall system, but they also apply to the subsystem level. And so what the iPhone did is it changed the keypad, which was a multiple jointed system, into a digital solution. And the only way that we could do that initially was to make the screen a solid immobile surface again. But once you've gone back to the beginning, in order to achieve a subsystem benefit in this case, you also know that the journey is going to continue, and you're going to go along the jointed route. And so Samsung Galaxy, the jointed phones come back into patterns, flexible battery, flexible screen, etc., etc. They've also got solutions which say, okay, the phones become a field. One of the big contradictions we've all got with our phone is, I want a small device, but I can't read the screen, so I need a big screen. And if I project the screen, then I've got a way of solving that contradiction. How do I project the screen? And so I've got a mini projector inside it, and there's the field. So this roadmap is trying to give some fairly concrete instruction in terms of this is the evolution trajectory that we should be looking in. Now, as a mechanical engineer, what this trend tells me is that my mechanical skills are going to take us so far up to the completely flexible, but then it's the fluidics engineer and ultimately the electronics and the electrical engineer that's going to win this game, because everything ends up with a field. Why? Because it's much easier to move electrons than it is to move atoms. So how can we use this trend? Here's an example from a case study we did with a client probably about 15 years ago. Now, they make bulletproof vests, and they asked us, okay, well, what's the future of the bulletproof vest? I don't need to know much about Kevlar or bullets either. I just need to know whereabouts is the bulletproof vest on this roadmap. And if it's not at the end, then I can give the client some immediate clues that say you should be looking at liquids and gases and fields, and ideally a field, because that's the end of the trend so far. One of the reasons I've got a research team, by the way, is just, can we find new trends, and can we find new stages at the end of trends? We couldn't find a field to solve this problem, but we could find a liquid. And now we can talk about it. The future of armor is liquid armor, I think. Far better at stopping a bullet. So TRIZ can tell us liquid. It can't tell us specifically what kind of liquid, but that's where I might go to the patent database and say, okay, well, are there any kinds of liquid that might be able to stop high velocity projectiles? And you end up with non-Newtonian fluids, which are shear thickening, and it's an extreme version of that. I think for me, one of the interesting things about this project is, once you've found this liquid solution, you've just made a lot of Kevlar scientists very unhappy. And so it's very important in the eventual design that Kevlar is still there. It's the liquids is doing the thing that's stopping the bullet. The Kevlar's making sure the liquid's in the right places. But I think when I was talking about route to market and some of these non-technical challenges, I think when it's particularly when you get above TRL6, that you're going to have to start worrying about a lot of these people issues inside organizations that you're going to license to. The carbon robotics solution that I began with, as soon as I knew this trend, I could have predicted the evolution of use of some kind of a field to get rid of weeds. It was an obvious thing. All I need to do is to look at a conventional weeding device in agriculture, see where it is on the trend, and recognize that eventually the whole job is going to be done by some kind of a field. Now 25 years ago, then I might have had to question, okay, well, what kind of field could I use? But here's one of those domains where we were working with a client where we it was probably about 20 years ago, where we said, okay, it could be a laser, it could be a microwave. Let's think about patenting now. And the decision was made, okay, well, I don't think all of the technology surrounding that is ready yet. Okay, so I'll come back to that shortly. So we've now, in the technical domain, we've found 38 of these trends. And the idea behind them is what we typically do is that here's another one. We look at any particular technology, whatever domain it is. The trends I'm showing you are very much about, I would say, physical products. But those of you that are chemists, for example, a lot of those processes are about, for example, processes, so time-related things, interface-related things. So not every trend is relevant to every domain. This is how surfaces evolve. And quite counterintuitive, this trend. Surfaces evolve like nature has evolved, very three-dimensional surfaces. So self-cleaning glass at the right-hand side, one of our projects. Geometric evolution, fairly obvious trend. I think this one, everything becomes more three-dimensional. I think we can see it in the world of architecture these days. But anytime you're designing something with straight edges, you know that there's a benefit somewhere in making it curved. And I'm a little bit embarrassed about this, but actually one of our most successful spin-out companies is this product here, which is a curved nail file. And the simple realization here was nail files are straight. The TRIZ trend tells me they should become curved. Let's go to the patent database and see if anybody's already thought of that idea. They hadn't. So we submitted our patent for a curved nail file. And we currently sell about 4 million of those a year in the UK and the US. Again, it's a really, really simple idea, but it comes from using these roadmaps that TRIZ gives us. So the way that we typically use these things to bulletproof a patent is you draw these kind of pictures on the right-hand side of this slide, which is what we call an evolution potential plot. So the first thing you can do, this is an example from the wind turbine sector, is you can compare the design of the turbine blades in this case and how they change over time. So that's a radar plot that's gradually expanding out. Is each of the trends is one of the spokes on the plot, and every time the technology makes a jump, we reverse engineer. Okay, which trend jump was that? And so you can see how far the technology has evolved. A bulletproof patent is literally all that white space on the plot. In other words, all the trend jumps that the industry hasn't currently thought about. Those are potential for new patents. And there's probably several hundred patents available that you could write today because the trends are known, but the industry is not using those trends, and more specifically, the patent lawyers for those companies are not using the trends. I have to say that when we've tried to introduce these roadmaps to the patent lawyers of the world, they're usually quite hostile to it. The exception to that tends to be the corporate patent lawyers who can see it as an advantage. Let's just say a few final things about contradictions. So in fact, all of those trend jumps are about solving contradictions. They're just patterns of contradiction solutions. But I think much more conventionally for people, something that I think you could apply very easily tomorrow if you want to explore using TRIZ, is to say, I look at a technology today. So there's on the right-hand side is a very, very simple example of a bicycle seat. Now, the reason I've chosen that is that bicycles are fairly universal things. Also universal is bicycle seats are very uncomfortable. And the reason they're uncomfortable is because since the bicycle was invented, the designers have been thinking in a trade-off fashion. And the trade-off, that's a picture on the left-hand side, is what we typically call a bubble map. On the right-hand side of it, you can see the basic contradiction is I want the saddle to be wide and narrow. I want it to be wide because that's where my body needs support. The two bones in my pelvis are that far apart. But I also need it to be narrow in order to pedal. Okay. Now, what every bicycle saddle designer has traditionally done is to say, okay, well, I want wide and I want narrow, so I'm therefore going to have to find the right shape that compromises between those two things. Okay. That's the stuff we get taught in school and college. We've got to make trade-offs in life. What TRIZ says is actually a far better solution would be to say, I want wide and I want narrow. So here's one of the TRIZ databases. This is the worst slide of this presentation, you'll be pleased to know. I'm not going to go into this in great detail, but basically this is what happens when you put 11.5 million data points onto one screen. The way this thing works is down the left-hand side is a menu of, okay, well, what are you trying to improve? And across the top, the same menu, but now it's what's stopping you from making the improvement. So contradiction is basically about pairs of things. Yeah, so I want wide and I want narrow. I want comfort for the person, but I also want function, efficiency, and pedaling. Yeah. So the idea is I find the appropriate row and column in this matrix. Inside each of the boxes, then I'll find a series of numbers, and those numbers relate to the strategies that other people have used to successfully solve this particular problem. And on the very right-hand side of the slide, you'll see a key to what those numbers mean. And what that key is also telling us is there are only 40 strategies for solving contradictions. The reason we call our company systematic innovation really comes from those 40 principles. Yeah, there are millions of ways of solving problems badly. There are 40 ways of doing it well. Is effectively what that tool is saying. So in terms of the bicycle seat, yeah, I'm not the only person in the world who's had this conflict between stress and adaptability, for example. I use the matrix. It tells me, yeah, principle 15, 35, 17, 13. Those are the ranked strategies used by other people. I look at principle 15, which says divide an object into parts from capable of moving relative to each other. And yeah, very quickly after that, you get to design a saddle like that photograph you can see there, which has split the saddle into two halves, which move relative to each other. So it's wide, supports my body where it wants to be supported, and it doesn't need to be narrow anymore because it moves with my legs. Okay. Simple example of what contradiction solving is all about. So final couple of thoughts. I'm conscious of the time. Back to my carbon robotics questions. When could we have predicted this technology? I think at least 25 years ago. We could have patented it 12 years ago. I think the limiting factor was not the laser. It was the identification of the weeds and the AI that sits behind that. But I think we could have patented it 12 years ago. And I think we could have produced it 4 years ago. Now, of course, the life of a patent is 20 years. So, patenting it 25 years ago would not have been a good idea. Patenting it 12 years ago, I think very definitely would have been. And I'm happy to say that we've got one of those patents. Our interest was in a personal one for a garden rather than for agriculture. We've also got one in the system which adds this to a drone. As soon as you've got a laser doing the job rather than chemicals, for example, then a drone becomes a much more possible solution because you don't have to carry the weight of the fluid around with you any longer. And it's very short pulses of laser energy that you need to kill the weed. So in terms of overall patent strategy, I've got 3 more slides to go if that's okay. I think we can see a significant split in the world right now between what I'll call the US version on the left-hand side, where unfortunately I think patents do the exact opposite today of what they were set up to do when the whole system was established. They now slow down innovation. They protect big corporations instead of the small lone inventor, and they very definitely protect the lawyers. So rule 1 is the lawyers get rich first, and I think America loves litigation. So it looks there like the pandemic kind of saw a reduction in it for a while, but it's back on the upward track again. China on the right hand side, I think interesting. They're playing the game. So they now file and get more grants to patents than America does. So that's a clear signal at playing the game. But I think culturally they don't understand IP, and it's a culture where if I copy you, I'm honouring you. And so as a company, if you're Baidu or Tencent, you're guaranteed somebody's going to come along and copy your solution within weeks, probably. And so the only commercial response to that is you just got to keep going. You just got to keep innovating. So the patent becomes largely irrelevant, but the government's sponsoring it. what's important is the technology moves forward, and it moves forward really, really quickly. They've created what I think is an innovation tornado. And I think interestingly also, the Chinese government is now mandating the use of TRIZ, being called the leapfrog engine. So I sell more of my books in the Chinese translation than I do in the English version these days. And I think that's quite a scary prospect, because you've effectively given them a systematic toolkit for generating lots and lots of IP. So what about CSIR? I'm conscious that your journey's the TRL 1 to 6 primarily, but I think also what most organisations do is they tend to do some research and then think about filing patents at the end of that research. I think hopefully I've planted a seed in your mind that says, if I know the TRIZ route maps, then I should be able to file patents much, much earlier. And I think that's if nothing else, a good insurance policy. There's nothing worse. And believe me, I've worked with a whole bunch of teams that have been spending years working on something. They've done the research, they've proven it. They've now start thinking about patent application, only to find that somebody's already filed something very close to what they've been working on for the last 3 years. You can file much earlier, and do it in a bulletproof fashion. I think if you've got bigger ambitions, this is an initiative I'm trying to encourage the UK government to contemplate at the moment, thanks to our Brexit disaster. I'm not sure I'm being successful, but I think hopefully again I've planted a seed in your mind that says, if you know these tools, you can file patents at a much greater rate. And what I mean by much greater is exponential. I think orders of magnitude. I think 1 order, 2 orders of magnitude are very possible with a relatively short amount of training, I would say. And if your ambitions are even bigger, I think my hopes for the world are resting with India these days. Enormous democracy and smart people, where people really value knowledge. I think it's also completely possible to say, let's kill the whole patent game. So I think we could publish everything. I think what the TRIZ trends allow you to do is to just say, all the jumps that we can see in the future for every industry, every domain, let's just publish all that stuff. Then nobody can patent anything, and we can escape from that system, and hopefully get on with solving some of the problems that the world needs us to be working on. So with that, I'll just say an enormous thank you. If anybody's interested in books, then most of them are ebooks these days. And also, I'm conscious I've just thrown lots of information at you. So if you've got any questions that we don't get answered now, then by all means email me. I've already promised to share a copy of these slides, as well as recording the session. So again, thanks so much for the opportunity, and I hope some of that's been useful for you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Darrell. It's been a very intense and very informative talk. Thanks so much. I'll open up the platform for questions. So maybe the people who have joined us on the platform today, on the MS Teams, can raise their hands, and I'll call out your name, and then we can take questions from the other platforms. So while I wait for my colleagues to raise their hands, let me ask you a question. You talked about, identifying in the case of the armors, okay, that you couldn't find any solution towards a field, but you found solutions towards the liquid, okay, the solution. So, I mean, how does the TRIZ help analyze and then identify which is more probable? Because when I look at, something that doesn't have any, entry yet, I would find the white space more attractive, and I would like to do my research in that domain. So how do you identify where the opportunity lies, and how do we pick on where do we want to put our larger resources into?
So I mean, I was personally involved in that particular journey with the armor. So in terms of the trend says, okay, the end of the road is field. So as a researcher, that's where I should start my journey. So as soon as you look at the domain of armor and the classifications associated with protection, then you're not going to find anything. So then you've got to abstract the problem and say, okay, well, what are the forces involved in a projectile, a bullet coming towards somebody? And now I need to go and look in other domains for field-based forces, that can stop that kind of incoming projectile force. And that's where we said, okay, well, I think we can find some candidates. So I think the electromagnetic forces at some point in the future will be able to stop bullets, but right now they can't. And so when we couldn't find anything in other domains that produce the necessary forces to counter the incoming force, then that's when we had to say, okay, I'm now going to have to step back, because in the horizon that the client has asked me to work in, there's no field that can solve this problem right now. So that's when we step back and start looking at the fluid-based solution. But we always, as China is doing, as soon as you know the roadmap, as a researcher, you go to the end of it and only step backwards from that, as and when you realise you can't achieve a solution.
You're on mute, Dr. Janani. You're on mute.
Yeah, sure. Sorry, thanks. That's lovely. One another question that I have is, when you're considering the TRIZ for the industry and TRIZ for the public research organizations like CSIR, would there be a difference in this strategy? And what should be the focus of an organization like the CSIR?
Yeah, I think that fits really well with the question that you just asked yourself, Vishwan. I think as a researcher, and particularly if you look at working on a national level, I think the best thing to do by far is to look at the end of these trends. So looking at the field-based solutions, for example. I know with a lot of my industrial clients, if they're making mechanical solutions, then they're very reluctant to make that leap, all the way to field-based solutions as far as this trend is concerned. And I think even I mentioned. Let's come back to Pilkington for a second. The glass company. So Pilkington make glass. This trend says things start off smooth, but there's a big advantage in going to three-dimensional surfaces, active elements. They were very reluctant, because they said, well, we spent all of our lives making the glass as smooth as possible. Now you tell me to make it rough, even if it is at the micro scale. So I think industry tends to be much more incremental. And I think customers, to some extent, are also quite incremental. There's an expression: don't get so far ahead of the parade that nobody knows you're in the parade anymore. But I think as the public sector research bodies, and I certainly know from ITRI, for example, I mentioned in Taiwan, where they use these trends very much as a way of saying, I need to go and look at the end of each of these trends, and that's where I should be focusing my research. And it becomes very much about who hasn't used a field yet, who hasn't used 3D surfaces with active elements, and those are the opportunities for commercialization, I think. But the fundamental research, the low TRL, I think really should be focused on the end of the roadmaps.
Vijay? Yes, maybe I'll only ask you another question. So in the context of the new AI tools and all that, I would believe that TRIZ started off with simple computational modeling and then identifying those patterns and things like that. So in the context of the machine learning and AI today, do you think it would be meaningful to do something along the lines of TRIZ to identify potential areas, and what would be the kind of growth that you see in terms of using such tools?
Yeah, I mean we've I think I did my first AI project in 1985 when I was at Rolls-Royce, so it's always been there in my mind. And I think that whole TRIZ direction toward the ideal solution, get the ideal software updates itself. For example, the team manages itself. I think AI is, I've always registered the fact that there's a connection between those two things. So two implications from my company's perspective. I think one is that we certainly use AI to do the research these days. So when I first saw TRIZ in 1991, we decided fairly quickly we need to update the research because the Russian, the Soviet research had stopped in the mid 1980s. They thought they'd found everything. So we said, we need to start it up again, and we opened an office in Bangalore actually. So a lot of that patent analysis and particularly patent summary skills were in India. So we opened an office in Bangalore. I say we had 40 patent researchers working for us at the time. Today we've got 2 because the majority of the search capability and that Apollo Sigma engine that I mentioned, for finding the quality patents, that's an AI basically. What it will do is it will read patent documents and it will identify the good ones for us. So we don't have to, each week when several thousand new patents get published, then we don't have to read all of them. We just point the software at them, and it says, okay, well, these are the good ones. These are the ones that I can't quite understand. So you'll have to analyze those ones manually. So it's multiplied our productivity by at least 1 order of magnitude, and probably 2. I think the other domain is that we've got lots of clients now where they've, I'll say, been forced to deploy some AI technology. I think we're heading towards another AI winter. In that it's there's some fairly difficult problems that need to be solved, which I think, as far as I can see, nobody in the AI world is really working on right now, or if they are, they're not generating solutions which are visible anywhere. So I've just published a paper on TRIZ, truth, and AI. So if anybody's interested, I can very happily share a copy of that. But I think that I think we're heading into an AI winter. But I would certainly be looking to what the paper's all about is applying TRIZ and some of these patterns. I mean, the patterns I've shown you today are very much about physical objects and how they evolve. But exactly the same idea applies to the world of IT. We've got 24, I think it is IT.
Especially that is in relation to TRL. So how do we decide whether it is to be published or patented?
Yes, I can certainly empathise with that challenge. I think I've oscillated several times in my career between academia and industry. Of course, in academia, and I guess in a lot of public sector research also, there's a pressure to publish or perish. But at the same time, I think increasingly national bodies are recognising there's value in IP, and as a nation, we need to protect this stuff. So I think the optimum strategy right now is that one of the things I said in my summary is it's a really good idea to file much earlier. Yes, and I think what the TRIZ trends enable us to do is to file patents much earlier. So I think the sequence is I think you can file patents very close to the beginning of the research. Actually, when you're down at the TRL1, TRL2, I think you can then put that on one side. You can do the research, and then you can publish whatever papers you like, because you've got the insurance policy of an early filing of the solution. So I think that's the advice right now. I think, as we know, also filing and particularly maintaining patents is an expensive business. And so if you suddenly find yourself filing 200 patents a week, then that's going to get expensive very, very quickly. So I think for me, that's when our Apollo Sigma tool comes in and says, okay, well, I'm only going to file high quality patents, and I'm going to sometimes it's a good idea to file lots of patents just to say to other players, competitors, stay away, this is my area. But if you don't want the expense of that, then at some point you use tools like Apollo Sigma to say, okay, well, these are the quality ones, so these are the ones that I'm going to maintain. But I think that third point I made is the one that says, this China versus US patent strategy is another contradiction, and I'm pretty certain it's going to play out in favour of the Chinese approach, which says the patent system is not fit for purpose anymore, and what the world needs right now is just more and faster innovation. So that I think is a route which very definitely recommends the publish route. Just get stuff out there, and let the entrepreneurs pick up the solutions. One of the plans that we've got for the UK is that you file early, and when you get to TRL 4-5, so you're working with the universities sector and the labs to get you to there, and then you're trying to foster a group of community of entrepreneurs. They're going to pick things up at the TRL 4-5 level and take them through to 9, and make the money for them, and for the country.
Thank you, Professor Mann. I hope it answers Dr. Pradeep Sahu's question. I have another question from Anil Kumar. Patent circumvention is tricky with high possibility of infringing patents of others. So what are your suggestions on avoiding patent infringement during systemic designing of innovative concepts?
Yeah, it's funny. We get two kinds of client jobs when it comes to IP. One kind is usually the startup companies, the entrepreneurs. Can you help me to create a bulletproof patent? The other job tends to be the big organizations, but they say, we've got this competitor patent over here. Can you help us to design around it? And so you get all the tools that I've been describing today, but particularly the contradiction tool, are very potent tools for designing around whatever patents you can find out there. So I think what we very often see is that you do that prior art search, you realize there is a patent out there already, and immediately that becomes an impediment. It says, okay, well, I can't go in this direction now. My view is, and I've had these discussions with patent examiners in patent offices in the US and the UK. The reason patents are published is it's the mountain of mankind's knowledge, and the job of the scientists and engineers is to build on that mountain. So what I see happening in China an awful lot is they will go to the patent database very early on in any kind of project, look for what's already there. Now, historically, they might have copied it. What they're now doing is say, okay, well, I find an existing patent. I'm now going to use the TRIZ tools. So I say specifically the contradiction tool. I'm going to find a contradiction in that current solution that's in that patent. I'm going to solve that contradiction. And almost by definition, that's going to give me a way to design around the existing IP. So in the last, we've been offering that service since 2001, and we have never failed yet to design around a patent. And I think I'm pretty certain the reason for that is that, as I mentioned earlier, I think the patent lawyer community is quite hostile to TRIZ.
Thank you, Professor Mann. I just have one question from my side. See, you said patenting is a very expensive affair, and often organizations like CSIR is always, the resources is a big thing, and so it's like you have to decide. You have a pile of patents, you don't know which is the one you want to file and which you keep, which you patent. So how will TRIZ help us navigate through this bunch of patents that we have? Say valuation. I'm talking is prior to even applying for a patent.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So I think I've come back to this picture here, that pie chart on the right hand side there. Again, we get asked that question an awful lot with our clients, whether it's universities. So we've just done one with the University of Warwick, for example, in the UK, which has traditionally been very good at academic spin-out organisations, but again, very finite budgets. So how do you decide whether to do something with the chemistry department or something to do with mechanical engineering or the business school? So if you've got a solution which is close to being able to patent it, then we've got the Apollo Sigma software, which will give you a good indication of how strong the IP is. But this pie chart here, I think, presents the broader picture. which says you need to consider all these other factors as well. So, is there a route to market? Can you find that route to market? What's the market demand like? So we've got tools there that will measure customer frustration, for example. Is there a problem out in the world that people are looking for a solution to it and are prepared to pay for that? So it's a much more holistic search that we will do. I mean, it's as you can probably imagine, I think the project we did with Warwick, they had a portfolio of I think about 200 potential projects, and they had funding for about a third of them. And so fairly quickly. So we spent, it was probably no more than 3 weeks evaluating those 200 against the market demand side, the route to market side, and the technology side, in order to produce effectively a cluster map that showed them, okay, these are the ones that you've got the highest likelihood of taking it all the way to commercial success.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. If I can ask one question, maybe I missed a point in your presentation, Darrell, but my question is more related to the prior art as such. It could kind of cover both patent literature as well as non-patent literature, that is, our publications and other things. Yeah. So, I mean, is there any attempt made on identifying the contradictions and solutions by using this prior art information and not just patents?
Yeah, indeed. Yeah. So, I mean, a lot of countries don't patent things. So, when you mentioned the traditional solutions database that you've got, then I'm immediately intrigued, because that's exactly the kind of thing that we would love to point our contradiction tools at, in order to add some of that stuff into the database that we've got. So wherever possible, we've done that. So again, we've built software tools, so natural language processing tools, which will read company reports, for example. So when we're working with a client, very often they will say, I want to have your global database, Darrell, but I also want to integrate it with my internal database, so that engineers and scientists inside my organization, they can not only access what the world has done, but also what other people inside the organization have done. So we did that with Procter & Gamble first, for example, and they'd had multiple situations where they'd filed a patent for something.
Yeah, Sujal?
Yes, good afternoon, sir. It is very interesting to know that you are saying, if you want to save the world, publish everything so that no one can file it. So if you can elaborate it, sir.
Yeah, it's a very controversial subject, I think, and one of my worries is in the healthcare sector, where I think a lot of the big pharma companies in particular say our business model is built on, we need to we're not going to get any revenue from drug development for 9-10 years. So who's going to make that investment if we don't have the patent to go with it? So having said that, I think there are some industries where I think it's very, very clear that the big companies are filing patents with the express intent of slowing technology evolution down. And so when we started to think about, okay, let's just file everything, we made effectively a ranked list of industries that said, okay, well, these industries are evil. They're deliberately slowing things down. These ones, I can understand from a business perspective why they need IP. So our strategy was, and if we get a chance to implement it, still is, let's target those industries where they're deliberately slowing things down. There's no justification for it other than they're lazy and they want to slow things down. And let's just publish everything in that domain and just open the field up to genuine competition. But more importantly, just to solve some of the problems that the world needs solving right now. So I think the summary answer to your question is, some industries are more angelic good than other ones, and I think you target this kind of strategy at those industries which are not good. So for example, I was mentioned at the beginning of the call, before we started it, the Western companies trying to patent basmati rice, for example, which I've used that case for a while now, which is just borderline evil. Yeah, I think it's just it's overt exploitation. It shouldn't be allowed. And so companies like Monsanto, for example, I think they will be right at the top of my list of saying, okay, let's just destroy their business model because what they're doing is not good.
Okay, thank you.
No, thanks for the question.
And there's a question from Dr. Unnikrishnan. He asks, how can we use TRIZ to identify when to protect the invention? He qualifies it with an example.
Yeah.
For example, the Hyperloop was invented and patented during the 1960s, while the application seems much more relevant in the present scenario.
Yeah. Again, as I mentioned at the beginning, that the whole question of timing is the most difficult part of the innovation story, I would say. So the work that we've done on timing for clients, and I think this picture, this pie chart that's still on the screen is probably a good one, because I think very often the timing is determined by the four things other than the technology. So the yellow bit of the technology, that's the easy bit. Is the customer ready for it? That market demand. We've built tools these days to measure customer frustration, for example. So we work quite a lot with Tata companies, and so we've done a number of projects with Tata Motors, both commercial vehicles, passenger vehicles, and when we've done analysis on driver frustrations in India, then a lot of the findings show you that the frustration has got nothing to do with the vehicle. It's to do with the traffic, the transport infrastructure. So the depressing message for the engineers inside Tata was that it doesn't really matter what you do, because there are bigger frustrations that the customer's got right now. So sometimes those kind of analysis can give you some news that you didn't actually want. But in terms of when should I file, I think one of the things we'll be looking at very early on is, okay, well, what customer problems does this solve, and do customers care about it? You mentioned the Hyperloop one, which is a great one, where the basic technology is there. It's a means of production one. I think it's those enormous infrastructure projects. Who's got the budgets? Who's going to be the brave region on the planet that's going to be the first one to adopt this solution? If you can't find that early adopter, then there's no point in patenting that solution. It's a combination of, can I produce it, and who's going to be the brave first one? It's that route to market, which is the biggest source of failure, actually. So I mean, if you recognize the patent buys you a 20-year window, then the overall equation says if there isn't an opportunity that I can commercially exploit within that 20-year window, there's no point in filing it. So there's a sweet spot, I think. So we've got a curve that we use internally, which says in very fast-moving industries, there's probably no point in patenting, other than the fact that you're going to do some kind of a cross-licensing deal with other companies. Because by the time the patent's granted, the technology is already on the market; it's probably gone. There's very slow industries like big infrastructure projects like Hyperloop, like mining, for example, where I think the pulse rate in mining, so pulse rate being how often do step changes take place, is about 35 years at the moment. So there's almost no point in patenting anything there, unless you can see that you're heading towards one of these pulses. So automation of mines, for example, is the upcoming pulse, and I imagine there's strong incentive to be patenting AI solutions and automated mine solutions right now because of the emerging step change. But then between those two extremes of it, the industry is moving too quickly or too slowly. There's that sweet spot, and I reckon it's around about 9-10 years. So the big pharma companies have got something right in terms of their product development cycle. I mean, I would criticize them for other things. I think they could do an awful lot to accelerate that cycle. But if you're about 9-10 years away from commercialization and getting your money back, then I think that's the sweet spot.
Thanks. It's been really wonderful, Darrell, that you could take time to join us today and then deliver such a wonderful, amazing talk. I request Vijay to, offer the formal vote of thanks, please.
Thank you. And to thank one. Thank you so much for we also when to protect, what to protect. I mean, those especially those aspects of when to protect. So I think it has been wonderful to hear from you. The other, I would like to thank all the participants here, my CSR colleagues, and all the others who have been here with us today. And once again, thank you, Professor Mann. Thank you to all the participants. And maybe any more questions, they would be possibly able to connect with Professor Mann directly if you were not able to ask them here.
Yeah.
So
absolutely.
Thank you so much, Professor. Thank you so much.
No, thank you for that, and thanks again for the opportunity. It's been a real pleasure. I've really enjoyed the questions, and if you want to know any more, if you want to explore doing something together, then count me in. I would love to have that opportunity.
Sure.